Well, thank you very much. I'm Mike O'Connor, the publisher of Insomniac Press, and I have to confess, my dog ate my memory stick, so I don't have any PowerPoint. I'm really sorry about that. Insomniac Press is about 20 years old now. I started the company, started producing small handmade books, running around to bookstores downtown, begging them to take them on consignment, and then it just got way out of hand from there. Today we produce about 20 new titles each year. Those books are distributed in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and Southeast Asia. We're doing a great deal of business selling foreign language rights. We're doing a lot more business selling film rights and television rights. But is that we're a small organization. Right? 20 books a year produced by about 5 people back at the office. And a couple of years ago, things started to change. Is that we started to see sales kind of flattening out, kind of drawing down. We started noticing that a lot of the traditional marketing tools that we had used weren't working as well. They weren't as sharp as they once were. And, at the same time is that we were very aware of what was going on in other cultural industries. Part of our publishing program, we were publishing a number of musician, author books, and we certainly heard the horror stories of what was going on over on that side. Incredible layoffs. The way that they did business completely changed, and over the course of maybe 3 to 5 years, that industry was unrecognizable, from what it had been previously. And that was really alarming to us, because when you looked at how the music industry operated, is that it was probably the closest to the traditional book model. And here it was unrecognizable now. How books got to market, how they were produced, had completely changed. And similarly, in another incarnation, is that I was a journalist for a number of years and started talking to a lot of my colleagues from that lifetime, and their industry was in disarray. They really didn't know what was going on. Newspapers were laying off people and continue to lay off people at an incredible rate. We saw circulation numbers dropping over the course of 5 years by 75, 80%. It was fascinating. Just a few months ago, a study came out from a trade organization in the United States that said that by 2015, most U.S. cities will no longer have daily newspapers. And that's astounding. That was a huge industry. And that scared the hell out of us, because we cannot be immune to that, to those kinds of changes. And so what I did, and started talking with other publishers, and they were experiencing similar problems, and we started to investigate what was going on, and if there were answers to this. Were there business models out there? And we started looking, of course, in our own industry first, and there were a number of instances, examples of new business models that were emerging. We looked at Harlequin, very impressive. We also looked at initiatives like Kids Can's Resource Center, right? Resource Room, where teachers can go in and they can find information about different courses and adapt that from the materials in their backlist, which was very malleable. We also looked at O'Reilly's Safari Media, where it's basically a subscription type of service. You can access the books as you need them, as much as you need, and it's just prorated along a subscription basis. We also looked at Wowio as well, wowio.com, which is an ebook reseller of sorts, where you can go and download books for free. How they make their money is through advertising, so looking at that advertising model and seeing how that worked. And of course, also started looking at Lulu as well. It's phenomenal, that type of growth in vanity publishing, but Lulu was clearly more than vanity publishing, is that it was really trying to create an entire community based on that, some of the ideas that Red Hat had developed as well, the same founders. But it was very difficult to, especially for a small organization, to figure out how do we approach this? What do we do? What are the skills that we need technically, organizationally, legally to make this happen? And where were we headed? But what we really started to focus on was what was going on in other industries, because in other industries they had a longer experience with technological disruption, massive changes in their marketplaces, and so on. And so, we poured through literally thousands and thousands of pages of reports, indices. It was extremely boring, pretty useless for the most part, because a lot of those people in those industries that had many more resources than we have in book publishing were having difficulties finding the answers. But what was interesting is that we ran across one particular project that was really quite fascinating, and actually felt that it had a lot of applications in the book publishing industry, from the American Press Institute. About 3 years ago, they started a project called Newspaper Next 2.0. And in that, they had hired a number of Harvard professors to look at the state of the industry, to come up with new business models that could be implemented by newspapers. Now, what was fascinating about this report is that it wasn't just a one-off saying, oh, here's what you should do, is that they followed those newspapers and saw how they progressed, their successes, their failures, and so on. They also talked in detail about the resources that were available to each newspaper. Now, these reports are actually free to download from Newspaper Next 2.0. What was great, too, about these reports is that you saw how small newspapers and large newspapers were dealing with this. And that you had newspapers that were, small weekly newspapers that had maybe 2 or 3 staff, and how they were trying to adapt. And you also saw, giant big city daily newspapers like the Dallas Star, and how they were adapting and, throwing quite a bit of money into these resources, like tens of millions of dollars into these efforts. What was interesting from that is that many of the things that they were doing and that they were recommending and that they were experimenting with, we felt had a better application and a better success rate in book publishing, right? Because they were still working on an artificial construct of a geographical location, as opposed to trying to build communities around ideas or genres or categories. So it was an absolutely fascinating project. Now, what we did with that is that we started working with trade organizations, talking to other publishers about various projects of how to make this happen, how to disseminate these ideas and practices and the experiences within these other industries. So today is that we're just wrapping up writing a thing called the Gutenberg 2.0 project, which is a 10-week course that we're doing with Humber. It's in association with the Ontario Book Publishers Organization and the ACP. And it's specifically geared to publishers and upper-level management in small and medium-sized companies. And we're going to, through the 10-week course, which is online, which is great, of course, is that it specifically looks at the tools that you need to, to make these transitions, to do this type of experimentation. And, also, more importantly, to look at the track records of people that have gone before, that have already tried these things. And so it's very valuable in all of this. But through this entire process, what became clear is that there were some very basic common threads that we could do at Insomniac. All 5 of us, in the cab, going to the bar, we could figure this out. And what we found was, right, one was digitalize your books. I don't have to tell you guys that, but it has to be malleable, right? Your content has to be malleable so that it can be, any format that people want your book in, they can have it. Whether it's an audio book, whether it's paper, print, and bound, whether it's somehow aggregated, as well as getting it into a form that hopefully will stand a little bit of the test of time. Right? It's very difficult to figure out what forms it will take and so on. Second was develop a web presence, right? And a web presence was you live on the web, right? That's where your business really is, right? And a lot of that's through SEO, all sorts of open source coding that we were able to utilize, and so on. Third was develop strong relationships with your readers, and that's about building communities. Traditionally, book publishers almost had no contact with the readers. And those are your customers. They're telling you whether or not, you've done a good job, and hopefully they'll give you some money. Not too long ago, you were completely in the dark. You had no idea who they were, where they were, what they were interested in, and why did they buy a particular book and didn't bought one and not another book. The other thing is maintaining good relationships with the authors, right? Is that these are the people that are part of that community, and usually they're experts in their field. If not, they're commentators, they're critiquers of that community. And it was interesting, too, to see that relationship in comparison with other industries. Because, in fact, book publishers had, oddly enough, a lot of people in this room won't believe me, have a lot better relationship with their authors than other creator-producer relationships. Like in music, they hate each other. They detest each other. You would see people go into meetings with body armor on. It was insane, that type of relationship. Also, for a lot of the periodicals, they're having immense problems with copyright moving to their online presence. And you got to realize too is that it became apparent that the difference between authors and readers was breaking down. They were one and the same, right? And that, in fact, for a long time, through all of these walls which we were publishing, is that we didn't realize that, right? And so you have to be prepared to understand that the author is also the customer, and that the readers become the authors. And that becomes increasingly important as you move into that digital realm, right? Where that's where your content comes from. Those are the guys that solve your really big problems. Those are the guys that move the mountains and build the pyramids and do all of that stuff that can be done for you. So in Gutenberg Gutenberg 2.0 is we really try to incorporate all of those things, right? What is that process? How do you do that? Not to the point where, here's the code, this is where you get the code, and apply it, but the overview of where you're headed. What are the business models what are out there? How to analyze your own resources and determine what is possible. Because, where Insomniac started from is that we had no resources, right? We had no money, we had no time. So, this was a really, how do you do that? That's our entire existence. That's the entire existence of much of Canadian publishing. But, how do you make these transitions? The biggest, the fifth element of those common threads was probably the most important one, is that we had to find a way to make innovation part of the core business, right? Is that everyone's job, everyone from the copy editor to the designer, had to find ways of innovating, right? And that in the same way that, good book ideas could come from anywhere, good ideas about new models and new ways of disseminating the content that we contain could come from anywhere. And it was part of everyone's job to do that. And that was a huge shift, right? To make, literally rewriting people's job descriptions to say, you have to innovate and you have to come up with ideas, every one of us, and that we have to change all the time. Like, this isn't just we change and then we're done. This is how we live. This is the street we live on now. And so that was key, right? And when you talk about new business models, that's the cornerstone of all new business models. And of course, with innovation as well. Innovation isn't done after 5 o'clock. It's not done on weekends. It's somebody's job. And you make sure that everyone in the organization knows that job and knows where to look, where to come up with innovative ideas, how to adapt them and make them work in your own business model as it's changing. It was interesting, like this morning, Steve talked about this a little bit, but he mentioned that, we're idea salespeople. Like, I like to, I thought it was a little more lyrical to say we're idea merchants. We're only as good as the ideas that we have. And the key part of that is that our success is based on not only the quality of those ideas, but our ability to disseminate those ideas and get them in front of people who can use them, right? And know who's using them, right? Those three elements kind of form what I think is quite possibly the next business model. The technology is all here to do that. It's a matter of putting the blocks together in the right sequence to make it work. And it's a pretty daunting task, but the biggest task is what we have to do back in the office. What we have to think about is our business. And it really is about being idea merchants and being the quality of those ideas and the ability to disseminate them. So, yeah. I'm going to open it up to questions. Anybody else? Oh, what time? Well, let me go on then. I'll just fill some air here. But it was, it's interesting too, is that it's difficult for those smaller organizations with the strapped resources to make these kinds of transitions. And that a lot of it, what we're finding is that as we make these transitions, like some of the things that we're doing at Insomniac is that we digitalized everything in the backlist, developing the web presence. But we've also formed strategic partnerships with other companies that might have more expertise than us. For instance, what we're going to be launching relatively soon, or another 6 months, is a series of websites based around the categories that we publish in. We publish a number of books in personal finance. We publish a number of books in self-help. And what these websites will do is try to build those communities. But what we're really looking for in there is to, it's an incubator for ideas and new books. It's an incubator for smaller projects, shorter projects that really wouldn't fit into the traditional kind of distribution system. Like, I think, some of the things that Harlequin in particular, it's really quite amazing. And I think, the people that are working in their digital department, digital products department, they got it. They've figured that out. But you have to realize, though, is that this technology is going to dramatically change the relationship between the author, the creator, and the audience. Is that the distances between those three bodies is going to become much, much shorter, to the point where, quite possibly, they will be interchangeable. right? You've certainly seen that occur on the music side, you know, is that the technology has allowed people to produce recordings that 20 years ago would have cost maybe $200,000, $300,000 to record, and now it's like you get it with your operating system and a couple of add-ons. It's for $50. You can produce this album, and there's a distribution system for them that costs very little. We're beginning to see that in book publishing. Like Lulu is that. That's what they're trying to do. You know, literally on Lulu.com, you can go on there without having to pay any money up front. And once you learn their online tools, is that you can go from manuscript to a laid out book in about, I guess like about 10 to 15 minutes, right? You can have that printed and on your doorstep the next day, like one copy of that. And that same time, it's available in their marketplace, along with all of their marketing tools and the community that they've built around that. That's a phenomenal thing. Like that's, when you think of the traditional way of producing books, is that this is down to a day and 15 minutes, and that will cost you about $10, right? That is going to have a massive effect on this industry, because what's going to happen is that, you know, you're going to see a lot more people self-publishing. The threshold has been lowered. But entire genres, entire categories, certainly authors on there, are going to develop completely outside of the publishing industry. So in that environment, you know, where does it leave a book publisher, right? Is that you got to realize, you know, is that it's you know, at first you despair and you cry and you wake up crying in the morning and things like that, but I've worked through that. The thing is that what you realize is that, you know, it goes back to those three core things. It's the ideas that you have, the way to disseminate them, and the knowledge of the people who are interested in those ideas. And in that fashion, not only, like Lulu's not going anywhere. It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And in that way, there are ways of utilizing things like Lulu and other sites like Lulu, and, you know, the 20 dozen other Lulu-esque like entities out there on the web, and utilizing that within your own business plan. So it's a very scary world, especially when it started looking outside of the industry, seeing what worked right, what went wrong, and looking at what's coming down the road for book publishing. Yes?
Where do you see pricing? I ask this because Carolyn Reedy of Simon & Schuster has astonishingly said that she thinks ebooks should be priced the same as the hardcover, which basically sounds like she just woke up yesterday and is going to call her music buddies and ask how things are going.
Yeah. Don't do that.
Yeah. This is insanity. So, like, do you fear that if we don't, you talked a lot about a lot of great things that affect your cost of production, which is really important, because what her argument was that distribution is just the end of this. You still produce this, so she's trying to price the product, basically subordinating the customer's desire to the product we produce. We make widgets. Out of
there, it becomes pretty hard to justify that cost to your customer, and they'll be really pissed off, and they won't come back, and they won't pay that amount of money. What they'll do is quite possibly go down to Lulu and pick something up similar for like $10, and it won't be good. I think in terms of pricing, like the market sets the price, and that's the scary thing. You know, is that it's quite easy to see that in a bookstore. You walk around, you see what everyone's pricing, you see what's moving, and you get a sense of a little higher, a little lower, and so on. But you can't really necessarily do that online. Is that ultimately, in terms of the pricing, is that the people buying it are going to price it, right? And that's where you're trying to get to. And so invariably, you know, in terms of how people value books right now, is that it's going to be lower. It's got to be lower. In some cases, it's free. right? And you have to find another way of deriving revenues from those books. And that leads into, kind of grappling with that entire Web 2.0 business model. It's a weird business model, right? Is that you take your core product and you give it away for free. So how do you make your money? It's sort of like, let's say Ford gave away cars, right? But how they made their money is that they sold advertising on the side of the cars, right? Do you think they could do that? No, they probably can't. But that has a lot to do with, the physical demands of the resources required for the production of cars. But we can do something similar, depending on how you structure your production workflows and where those production workflows really are. So it's a very, yes, it's a long way to go. Yes, we should change the pricing in there. But that's the thing, each reader will set that price. Yeah. Oh.
The digital world is loaded with opportunities, but it's also a challenge to try and determine which of those opportunities to move forward with. And we're talking about innovation and being part of the culture of your company and the limited resources, both human and financial. What's the process you use to determine which innovations or areas to change or opportunities to move forward with and to prioritize?
It's that, you have to investigate whatever new technology might lend itself to publishing. Did everybody hear that question? No? Okay, everyone heard. Good. Is that, how do you prioritize what to investigate? How do you with limited resources and what to adopt and experiment with? Is that you do the investigation, right? You look at, are there any examples of other publishers using it? Are there other people in other cultural industries utilizing that technology? You try to find track records and all that. If there's no track record for the technology, it becomes a very risky type of technology. And you have to look at, in your balance sheet is that how much risk are you currently carrying, right? Can you withstand that? In the same way that you will keep track of debt, you'll keep track of, hours worked, things like that, try to keep track of risk. And so we try to make that type of calculation by analyzing the amount of risk that we're currently using and the risk that we're taking on over the course of, let's say, a year or so. And so it's tough, right? And then, but really looking at that risk analysis and if the technology requires a larger scale, is that start talking to people in trade organizations about collaboration of how you might be able to use it and mitigate the risk through that area. So it depends on the technology. Like if it's an easy thing, like it's one little piece of software, we can accommodate that quickly. But if it's a new process, if it's fundamentally changes our production flows, changes our business model, you got to take more time to do that investigation.
I kind of meant which ones you prioritize to even investigate.
Oh, which one?
You know what I mean? Like if there's
Right.
so many of them to choose from, you have to choose every day which ones you're going to spend a minute on to think about going forward.
Right.
And so the endless ideas come from people about what you might do. And so internally in your group of 5,
Yeah.
you guys sit around and all go, okay, we've got 6 ideas on the table, which one are we moving forward with?
Yes, we do. Is that we have staff. So yeah, have a staff meeting. Keep records of all the technologies, and what becomes clear is that there's certain sources of innovation, certain centers of innovation as well, that you keep an eye on, and a lot of those ideas come from there. But yeah, it's that we sit around and talk about that, and you do, a big part of that, the prioritization though, is the risk analysis on the new technology, how much it will actually cost, and what are the risk carrying costs at this time. No, Mark.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could, this morning, Greg touched on the idea of economies of scale coming through collaboration. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that comes into play in digital experimentation.
Yeah. Well, actually, especially our first endeavors in digitalizing our books, and collaboration was really important in terms of, that conversion of our backlist and so on. I don't think we could have done it on our own, given the 5 of us and our resources at that time. And so that worked out really well when we had to get all our books. And we'll keep doing that because the technology keeps changing, and there's scales of economy that we need. The other thing too is people keep talking about crowdsourcing as well for these kind of larger labor-intensive projects. And so, trying to build those communities is the first step in that, and seeing how crowdsourcing might eventually be able to do a lot of this as well. In the interim, those projects are done collaboratively with other publishers of similar interest, similar size, and that's been really, really effective. What he was talking about in terms of book distribution and warehousing, that makes total sense. That's industrial, and we can't do that. But when you start talking about these kind of mammoth projects in the digital area, is that I think there's lots of ways to work collaboratively, as well as is that information becomes the asset as well, and that if you are able to borrow, create, and lend at various times that information, particularly in these processes, is that you all become richer. It's kind of counterintuitive. Well, it should all be mine, and I'll figure it out myself. But if you can share that information and understand, how it benefits different organizations in different times, then it can be quite good. Now, that leads me to something else too, was that in terms of where the industry is kind of going, we were talking, the gentleman in back had the question about pricing, and talking about how the reader will ultimately set those prices. The market sets the prices and so on. But that's the thing, is that what you'll find is that not only is the reader determining the format that they'll read the books in or access the information in, they'll determine the pricing of that book, but at the same time is that they'll determine the shape of your publishing company. And that certainly what I've seen with a lot of people in the music industry, of how that industry has changed, is that what a record label does now and did 10 years ago is quite different. And that's been shaped by this changing marketplace. It's been shaped by the music fans. And the thing is that now one record label, smaller ones, larger ones, one record label comparing it to another record label, they look like completely different animals, right? Is that you have some of them that are solely making money on merchandise, selling baseball caps. Others have gone into artist management. Others have gone into some very very unusual and nebulous kinds of business processes, and they've completely reshaped themselves. That is going to happen in this industry. There won't be one business model. There'll be thousands of different models, all interacting together, and it's going to make for quite a different industry, right? That's almost constantly in flux. The only constant will be that change, and will be the readers telling us who we are and what we do. Any other questions? Oh, wow. Thank you very much.